Hello guys and welcome for another Aeternum video. The release of New World Aeternum has finally come to life and oh boy is it amazing. The nostalgia about the rush in the early levels and the packed up cities from Windsward to Brimstone filled up with hundreds of players was just an amazing experience and unforgettable moment for all the new players out there. Of course, every start has its own honeymoon period and we know really well that once we hit the maximum level, everyone will aim to get the best out of their builds in terms of performance. Today I will talk about a build which many of you know already, as it was one of the bests when it comes down to DPS. Of course, I'm talking about my favorite Rapier Bleed build for PvE. The Rapier in general was always a top performing pick in terms of damage when it comes to PvE, and with the release of the artifacts, this was just elevated to another level. I believe that every high-end party which is aiming to conquer the top 5 standings for both leaderboards for expeditions cannot pass on the Rapier to be one of their DPS weapons. Before going into the details of the build, however, I want to make a quick recap on how the Bleed Rapier works and why the damage output for this weapon is considered as the rank 1 in DPS. For the people who already know everything about the Rapier, you can skip the next minute or so, but if you think that something might be new for you, feel free to continue eating your popcorn. The Rapier skill tree is split into two categories named Blood and Grace. The Blood one, as the name suggests, is focused on applying bleeding effects on the targets with the help of the Flurry and Tondo abilities. The third ability in the skill tree is called Flourish and Finish, and basically this is the final nail in the coffin, as it will consume all the bleeds applied from the Rapier at once. This means that if you have the maximum amount of bleed stacks on a target, which is 3 at the same time, they will be all consumed in a single burst of damage alongside with the damage of the ability itself. On first glance, it might not seem like a huge damage potential, but the key for this to work is to maximize your damage output by empowering yourself as much as possible just before applying the bleeds, as well as increasing the bleeding duration up to the maximum of 20 seconds. As an example, we can simulate a simple test in which we can apply bleeds that are causing 150 damage per second on the enemy target. If our duration of bleeds is maxed out on 20 seconds, this would be equal to 3000 damage, meaning that if we consume the bleeds right after they were applied, we can get the 3000 damage instantly and we don't need to wait for the full duration of the bleed. Now that we know how the bleed works, let's take a look at the Grace skill tree. Here you will quickly notice that the approach in terms of ability is quite different. The Fletch and Riposte are both amazing abilities, but they cannot serve as a main DPS source due to their nature and long cooldowns. However, the last ability in the skill tree is Evade. At first, it looks like a useless dash that doesn't provide much apart from animation cancel and a small increase of the damage, but this actually is the main difference when it comes to perfect rotations and cooldowns. See, when we combine the Evade skill with all the correct passives and the perks from the ability, we will get the boost of damage as well as the already mentioned animation cancel. This is extremely important as we need to apply few hits to the enemy target in order to get our rotation going smoothly. Some people might question the choice of Evade instead of Tondo, which can simply give us the extra bleed stack, but after extensive testing, the result shows that the Evade is overall better in terms of damage over the Tondo. So how does the build work? We already explained that we need the maximum amount of Empower before applying our bleed stacks. We know that we exchange the Tondo for the Evade in order to have faster animation cancels and cooldowns, and we also know that somehow we need to hit the 20 seconds bleed duration for the maximum damage potential. Let's start from the armor pieces, as they are quite easy and simple to explain. The first and most important armor piece you need is of course your artifact. The most common artifact for a Bleed Rapier user was the Nimble coat, as it was providing an additional 8% of cooldown, which means that after a perfect flurry in the back of your enemy or the boss, you would have around 1.5 seconds until the next flurry. This gap of 1.5 seconds can be cleared with a simple tap of a basic attack, and then you could perform Flurry again. Indeed, the build was amazing and the damage output is really strong. However, the issue might come when you are misplaced or something doesn't go right way and you don't get back your Flurry on time. For this new variation of the build, I'm replacing the Nimble coat and I'm taking the winged leather shoes. With that change, I'm trading the 8% cooldown from the coat for the 10% base damage increase, which will affect all my bleeds as well as my basic attacks and abilities. But wait, if I lose the 8% cooldown from the Nimble coat, how can I get the rotation of bleeds applying by the Flurry? How many seconds I would have to wait after a perfect Flurry if I already had to wait 1.5 seconds with the Nimble coat to start with? Well, you will have around 2.5 seconds when you use the winged leather shoes. And right here is the necessary change to Evade instead of Tondo, which I've mentioned earlier, because after the Flurry you can instantly hit a single auto followed by Evade and another auto in order to refresh completely your Flurry. Technically the difference is only one auto attack more, as the Evade animation is quick enough to not lock you in place or animation frames, which will not result in extra time. Don't believe it? Let's go and take a quick look at the two different rotations. Both are performed with the same gear, attributes and items, with the only difference of the two artifacts. And with that out of the way, let's continue our build explanation as we need to touch on few more details. The remaining perk for the armors are basically the same as the last season, as you need to prioritize Enchanted Ward and Refreshing over everything else. Of course, since we are running Bleed Rapier, we need to have the perk Leeching Flurry somewhere in our gear, and in case you want to increase even further your damage output, I would suggest you to take Omnidirectional Evade as well. This way you can get the damage increase after Evade by using it in any direction, and it would boost the attack right after. For jewelries, the choices are also quite clear and stable. On the amulet you want to have the type of protection which is corresponding to the mutation or the type of damage dealt by the enemy. Another good choice would be Refreshing if you don't already have the 4 in your armors, but if you do, probably you want to have Health or Empower. Keep in mind that the Health perk will get a small nerf, but still it is probably overall the best perk when it comes to PvE. My favorite ring for the build would be the Soul Pollen, as it comes with leeching and thrust damage, and for a third perk I would get Hearty. Of course you can craft yourself the same piece, but it might be a bit more expensive, so have that in mind. In the past, Bloodletting was also an option for the ring, but due to the passives from the attributes at 150 dexterity and 250 intelligence, plus the passive of the Flurry Coat to the Bone, and the last addition to the build, which is the new perk Disdained Infliction, we are hitting the cap of 20-second bleed duration without any issues. Meanwhile, having the thrust damage guarantees us 7.8% in power if the ring is 725 gear score, and the leeching will give us the necessary lifesteal in order to get the maximum out of our pristine diamond gem on the weapon. For earring there are quite a lot of good perks which you can use. The most important two of course are Refreshing Toast and Refreshing, and for the third perk I would usually go for Purifying Toast, but you can also choose Empowering Toast. The next and final step of our gearing will be the weapons, and here the only concrete piece would be the Artifact Rapier, which is the finisher. It comes with fixed perks and the gem slot, so you have to choose one perk and you need to slot a gem. Previously the best perk for it was Keenly Empowered, but as I mentioned, there is new cool kit on the block, and that's Disdained Infliction. This perk would not only boost your bleed damage by 15%, but it will also guarantee that you are getting the 20 seconds bleed at all times. And if you think that this was all, the perk has a passive in PvE that would benefit you another 5% of damage to AI targets which are affected by damage over time effects. Of course, the gem slot remains as before, clear, non-rune-glassed pristine diamond. This way, with good positioning and keeping your HP at maximum, you will be able to gain another 15% more damage. The big question is about the secondary weapon for the build. Previously I was using the Ice Gauntlet, but now I think I might go with Void Gauntlet. The main reason for that might be the small changes to the group weapons, as some healers are now prioritizing Flail over Void Gauntlet. As it gives a lot of buffs and debuffs, the Flail can be extremely important in your groups. This happens quite often when the tanks are running with Sword and Shield and Hammer, for example, so hence my choice of a Void for a secondary weapon. If you choose to run with the Void Gauntlet, I would prioritize taking the Oblivion, as it will give power to all the teammates around you, Scream for better clump management and potential disease when you have the perk, and last but not least, Tether, which will secure another 20% of Empower for the next 10 seconds, which would be extremely beneficial and would make your job of keeping the 50% Empower for longer way easier. The perks for the Void Gauntlet can also be slotted on the weapon, and the gem doesn't really matter that much. After all, it is just there to support you with abilities for a few seconds and then you are back to your rapier. In terms of attributes, I would say that getting the 350 intelligence, 150 dexterity and 25 focus is mandatory for the build. From there on, it all depends on you. You can be the 5 constitution hero that you always wanted to be, and you can invest the remaining points in dexterity for insane amounts of damage. Or you can slot some points into constitution in order to survive a hit or two. Some people might even consider 50 focus so they can get increased healing by 10%, but believe me, if you are playing high-end PvE, you don't even get the chance to receive heals if you are running low constitution. I for myself know that I will be the tryhard going with 5 constitution and wiping the floor. Not with myself of course, but with the enemies. For Hearthrune you can take whatever your team needs, especially if you are running with premates, but in my opinion Detonate remains the best choice from all, as it doesn't lock you in animation, so you can keep your rotation going all the time. Another extremely important note are the skill trees for both weapons, and I will just touch on them for a second, as we had a small change which now forces us to lose one good passive on the rapier side. As you can see, this was the old rapier bleed tree that I was using for the build. There is not much to be said about the points into Flurry and Flourish and Finish, as they are your main 2 abilities. Also, from the left side I was using Refreshing Strikes and Unerring for lower cooldowns and more damage over targets affected by bleed. From the right side I was investing 4 points into Evade so I can reach the bonus of Adagio, and the remaining 3 points were used in the passives, as you can see them for better cooldown, higher damage while at full HP, and of course the extra movement speed on hit, which will technically keep up the passive effect from the artifact boots. The changes in this season are not drastic when it comes to the skill tree, but the issue is that Evade is no longer an option from the first line on the right side of the skill tree. This means that we have to take one of the passives which are not that beneficial for the build, just so we can unlock the Evade. Then, if we again invest points up until the Adagio from the Evade tree, we will be left with just 2 points while we have 3 amazing passives. We cannot really pass on neither of them, as the 10% damage while at full HP, the extra 5% cooldown reduction on critical hit, and the necessary movement speed are a must for the build to work. My suggestion in that case would be to drop the Adagio and Allegro passives from the evade, as we actually hit just a single evade into auto attack in a perfect combo. This means that the 10% lost in our damage of the auto attack would not be that significant when it comes to overall better passives for the bleed. Another positive thing would be the extra skill point, which we now have, and we can also slot it on the left side using Enguard. Gaining additional 10% damage to targets over 50% HP is a nice boost. On the side of the Void Gauntlet, the skill tree is quite simple, and as mentioned before, we need 3 main abilities: Oblivion, Scream and Tether. Then we want to take few passives which are technically providing us with some extra empower and critical chance, but as I said, due to the nature of the supportive item, those passives will not have a huge impact. And with that guys, I think that I've gone through everything related to the Bleed Rapier build for Season 6 and maybe beyond. I think that this will definitely be top 1 best DPS build when it comes to PvE due to the buff affecting the damage over times effect directly. Since I will make few other builds for PvE and PvP, as well as guides related to the progression in the game with cool tips and tricks, make sure to subscribe to the channel in order to not miss them in the future. If you want to catch me live streaming or you simply want to discuss something, please check the description below where you can find links to the streaming platforms as well as my Discord community server. As always, thank you so much for watching and I will see you on the next one.